Lise is an environmental planner, or ecosystem planner with the city of Burnaby. She's been there for 4 years. And before that has been a consultant and worked in Capital Regional District. A few other things on your LinkedIn profile, but I'll let you introduce yourself. But basically, the question we've asked Lise and Dale to respond to is, what is your community thinking about in terms of sustainability measurement and related metrics? And to relate that, if you can, to what you've heard here today.
These presentations have helped me to understand, the project a little bit more and what it's aiming to do. So, the City of Burnaby, I think, is very interested in sustainability. We're, as hopefully those of you who are new to the area know, Burnaby is the next door neighbor municipality to Vancouver, part of the regional district here. And I guess what's foremost in my mind is because right now I'm co-leading staff lead on a project to develop a sustainability strategy, environmental sustainability strategy for the city. And it's very much a kind of a broad community-based consultation process. And so it's been going on for just over a year now. And we're right now in our second phase of consultation with the public. And so it's been a bit of an organic process to try to understand what the issues and concerns are from the public. And now we've been working with Peter's help and some other consultants to develop a bit of a framework going forward to say, here's some goals and strategies to try to make our city more sustainable. So I think tools like this can certainly, I could see a place for it in helping towards being a greener, more sustainable city. I guess just a couple of thoughts come to mind about the tools that you're talking about, and I think that some of the places I think that we could potentially use them are in some of these broad planning strategies that we're doing, like the environmental strategy. We're also updating our OCP right now, and of course we have community plans that are updated as we go along. And I would just be curious, before sort of recommending to my managers or council that we use a tool like this. Obviously, as a scientist, I'd want to understand more about the tool and the assumptions that are underlying it, and how transparent it is. And then sort of the political side is trying to understand, are there concerns about when you map out the neighborhoods and you identify problem areas, how much of a concern is that sort of politically? Is that something that is there reluctance to try to highlight, I guess, problems in your community, and particularly if they're problems that the city can't necessarily do anything about in the short term, or maybe doesn't have jurisdiction about?
Actually, in some of the municipalities, it's the local council who has been asking us who's giving actually the assignment to us to make things. So you might say the alderman and the mayor had to do these kind of things because it was requested by local council. And that's interesting because in these type of things you could say, in this situation you could say that the council is taking charge of things. And it's interesting because it more or less it's being used as a device to direct more or less the actual policies of the community.
Dale, as probably you know, is the development director. Is that your name? Sure. Yeah, development director, manager of sustainability. It's been all kinds of titles at UniverCity, which is the model sustainable community adjacent to Fraser University, and has been very interested in working on this whole question of measurement and assessment for a long time. Dale also wears other hats. He's on the board of directors of the International Living Buildings Institute. Is that right?
Sure. Futures Institute.
Living Futures Institute.
Yeah.
And the Canada Green Building Council. So, Dale.
Hi. So a lot of people know about in this room know about the UniverCity project, but just a lot of people don't know really what we are, how we operate, and why we try to do what we try to do. And its context either to the city of Burnaby and other municipalities, North Van, Port Moody, or others. And so in that model, a big part of our strategy is incremental sustainable growth. And through incremental sustainable growth, it's trying to measure what that growth is and where sustainability will take us in the future. So what have we done, where are we now, and where are we going? And that's where we get really interested in assessment tools. So we've probably looked at every assessment tool at the neighborhood scale under the rainbow. You know, we've looked at One Planet Living, we've looked at Lead ND, we've looked at the community capital, we've done the FSA approach with the Dutch students that were here a while ago. We've made up some of our own. We've looked at some hokey ones. And what we found is really there's nothing that has invested itself in telling the story of the community from a social experience, from a neighborhood experience, from a green building experience, from an environmental experience, and that sort of that holistic kind of approach until we started looking into the community capital tool and the FSA tool and starting to see the overlaps between those tools. And it's interesting to us that when tools start coming together, they become more powerful because they've landed on the same things. So you have some independent thinkers out there like the Lead MD, they just, you know, you got to go through a system, you got to get a score, and at the end of the day, the score tells you something, but it doesn't really tell you anything. And then there's those that are looking at sort of a more holistic view about living in this place, and about building this place, and about the goals and ambitions of this place. And that's where these two rating systems have seemed to sort of land collectively. So we're really interested in that. We're also interested in the ability to use these tools both selfishly and in a larger context. So selfishly, we're a developer that are selling homes. We're selling land to developers, we're also building buildings, and we're selling them. So we want to make money. So one is, how can we use these tools to say we're better than someone else? Or at least understand ourselves within that marketplace of sustainable communities. So both internally to the Lower Mainland and externally. So when people are shopping at UniverCity, they're looking at stuff along the low-heat corridor. They're looking at the new town center stuff that Burnaby's developing. They're really looking at the Suderbrook Newport area in Port Moody, and they're looking at Lower Lonsdale in North Vancouver because we're all connected to the forest and the natural environment and the water. And so how do we differentiate ourselves from them? And often part of that differentiation for us is the sustainability story. People are choosing to purchase into the community because of the sustainability element. But then beyond that, we also want a tool that we can use internally or with the community to say, where should we be projecting out? You know, what will keep us at that one competitive advantage 5 or 10 years out, but also what will create the place these people want to live in 5 or 10 years that will allow them to stay. And we're starting to see fruition in that kind of planning strategy, because typically in high density developments like ours in the Lower Mainland, you're typically about 11% families. Because what happens is a young couple moves into a new community because it's affordable to them. You know, they buy a smaller unit, it's a first-time home buyer. They're planning that eventually they're going to have children and they'll move out to the suburbs, or they'll try to find something larger. But what's happening at UniverCity is they're not moving out. So they're staying in those same, 2-bedroom units or 3-bedroom units. They're having children, and now we're closing in on 35 to 40% families living in the community. And that's telling us that it's really not necessarily about the home size, but it's about the place you live in and how comfortable and how safe and that sense of belonging you have to the community. So you'll make that smaller space or that affordable living work for you. And these tools, I think, will help us both rationalize those decisions, but also are great tools for us telling the story and telling the story to future developers in the community about, this is why you should build here, this is why we build at higher densities, and this is the reason these kinds of communities are becoming, or should become, the norm in North America.
I'm Davis, I'm the Sustainability Manager for the City of Burnaby, which is undergoing quite a bit of change right now. In terms of the model and tool, I think one of the strengths of that tool is helping to reinforce a conversation of sustainability, that it's not just environment, and it's not just economy, and it's not the trade-offs between those different buckets. I think that in my experience that we've lost that sustainability is about integration, and it's about getting value across everything so that we can actually have generations here living good lives for the futures to come. And it's just my experience, but I feel that it's got more reduced to specific issues. So at some point it was pollution, and then it becomes like energy and climate change, and then we forget about biodiversity, right? Because the agendas keep changing. So I think a tool like this can really, really help keep sustainability at an integrated level. The tool is probably more helpful, just from my perspective, as a longer term support tool that would feed into more holistic strategic planning. I could see that doing something like that to help inform the OCP update would be beneficial, but it would be difficult to use it on an annual basis because I think it would engender a lot of debate around what is the norm and then, well, what about this and what about that, and it would lose its integrated holistic momentum. So I think it would work really well there. I like the opportunity around framing it around capital because people do manage assets. And one of the words that I've been looking at is trying to figure out how do you get some of the capital that isn't in the accounting capital software and into the assets into that so that we're actually measuring it. And I think using that language in this tool will help that transfer. So yeah, I see a lot of shared.
You know, along with Ingham from the city of North Vancouver, it's a city that does take sustainability to heart, build on Mark's and many others who's contributed to that, the 6 components, the full, complete sustainability framework. I think our challenge now is the neighborhoods, it's about communities, it's about social. We're a denser city, we're like New West, Vancouver, we're smaller. Most of our people live in these types of neighborhoods, and we're recognizing what's different about that and how they live and how we can support them and to have amazing, sustainable lives within our neighborhoods. And on a more professional note, we're looking to shift where we're going from make it living in OCP. We get away from the plan. We have a 100-year vision. We have that kind of long-term thinking. How can we be a more adaptive city? So that we're always, in that early adopter mode, like we're not just taking big steps, we're taking little steps and we're learning. That's the idea of assessment and monitoring. It's central to that notion. How, where are we at? How can we adjust, fine tune instead of big fun? And I think that's the challenge. We're taking big steps. We need to have just a framework for doing a lot of little things over time. We actually have all those components, and that's where this type of framework or model is potent. The challenge is how does that evolve? Even our 100-year vision, which was only a few years ago, really. I look at it now. Wow, what we've just learned in the last couple of years has already starts to date it, right? Because it doesn't have a social component as strong as it would like to be, or it doesn't have another component, it doesn't have a cultural component that is strong as it would like to be. Which reminds me, we need a nimble framework. We don't need a big model and a big high-performance machine. It's a challenge.
I was just thinking, while we were talking about how we would get traction to use something like this in the city of Vancouver. Right away, I thought of a couple of challenges. One would be a resource challenge, because right now our budgets are being hacked and slashed. It seems that everybody's running around trying to do the basic things. So that would definitely be one area where I think you have to. And thinking about the number of criteria and simplifying it, I think that would be an absolute must in terms of trying to get some traction. The other thing that I reflected on is perhaps a reluctance on the part of council to get involved with something that might reveal some things that they may not want to have revealed because it will put them in a place where they need to respond to it. I think right now they feel like there's a whole range of things that they already have to respond to. So to pull the curtain back on some other areas like, oh my God, now there's these other things that come to light that we have to address in some fashion with our other resource issues, another potential problem. Reflected on some of my experience doing community planning, and my experience has been if you can have conversations with people that provide the information, it's an honest and open conversation, I think you do make progress. It's just difficult and very time consuming to have those sorts of conversations, and it does come down to values and personal values, and I think there is ability to bridge the gap and show how the values can be preserved, but in different forms in a much more sustainable way. But it's time consuming, it's difficult and challenging.
Thank you for that. John, do you have comments on two things in particular? One is the question of sort of how public or private you might be with the information if a client is a municipality and they don't really want stakeholder involvement, and the other is about resourcing in tight times.
Yes. Ideally, you want to have stakeholder involvement from the beginning. What we sometimes do is, sometimes it has something also to do with budget available and all these kind of things. What thing is a necessary condition for these for the tailor-made things we make is that we say somewhere in the process you should have a way of communicating with regard to results with others. Otherwise, you're just keeping it for yourself. I think that's not the purpose. But you could start with the existing strategic visions and try to build a monitor on what's already available. And then you hope, and that's at least that's the advice I would always give to others, go out, talk with others about it, because if you only keep it for yourself, then because the problem for budget restrictions is in all communities. But at the same time, there's money out which you can use for the purposes. So if you only talk about yourself or about your own intentions, then you miss perhaps some change. So that's one thing. The second thing, and that's why our benchmark gives us also an opportunity to do it in a different thing. Benchmark gives us the possibility to deliver a municipality for low cost a basic monitor, and we could say, okay, we can build upon, we can fine tune it, we can add some things, we can start a discussion with it. So one of the things we have been discussing, and that was one of the things I proposed also to do it here, is that we try to build up databases with a lot of information that's publicly available for all municipalities and perhaps for neighborhoods. I don't know anything about the Canadian statistics, but in Holland they're pretty good. So we came for all 400 municipalities. We had 90 publicly available indicators. So we could build a complete database, complete monitor. Perhaps you even are dreaming about it, but at least we could do that. But that could be a starting point, and if you have less, then you do it with less. But you could say this is a starting point with it. You could go, okay, say it costs you $5,000. This is available, and we can build up on this type of experience and on this type of information. So that could be done, but then it would not be so costly to create it as we do it in a more tailor-made company, because those cost, let's say, €50,000, and the other costs $5,000. The impact is different, but it can be done. So that's why we, in the end, from a business perspective, from our own business perspective, it's interesting to build on that. And then you could add the information. For instance, if you have more or different information, or even better information, you could fill in the gaps and we could complete it in a different way. And that's the way how you could do it. So my suggestion would be, I think we are going to work on that in the next period, is to build up at least databases with as much public available information, which we try to fit in the framework, and then you can go out and add some other things.
Yeah, I think that the hope would be that if you're doing a neighborhood planning process, that this would be an easy supplement to the sort of policy review that you would typically do, or it might help actually to structure that policy review in the same sort of categories, so you can again link that policy with the performance. Yeah, I think I appreciate that there aren't any extra resources to do this at all, and we've talked about the possibility of pulling together at least a subset of the indicators that are just based on readily available data. We certainly have in our initial development of indicators decided that there were a set which really would be tough to evaluate except by survey, and another subset of maybe 4 or 5 which would be best evaluated by actually looking at the built form and making some basic measurements of it, whether it's based on GIS or if it's an actual walkthrough. So at the neighborhood scale so far, we're thinking that a good chunk of it could be based on readily available data and data that's free to municipalities already, but that there would be some components that you'd have to do some kind of household survey, and that might be integrated with surveys that you would typically do anyway as part of background research for a neighborhood plan.
Just in thinking about, like sort of scale and like neighborhood versus city or region wide, something that that maybe has a little bit of an analogy is, so the Metro Vancouver has been doing some work on ecosystem mapping. And so that work, I think, is helpful for getting a bit of a high level kind of baseline, right, about ecosystem health and some of the attributes at a regional scale. Then what we're hoping to do eventually, when we have some resources, is to take some of that information and then sort of scale it down to the city of Burnaby scale and do some more work and add to that and say, now looking at this finer grain scale, what are things looking like in sort of a baseline, and how can we use that to inform some strategy for improving the health of our ecosystems. But I think having the start and having that region-wide picture is helpful for building on it, and also sort of gives us something to start from. So it's not just kind of starting from scratch, and it's not just kind of like the city all as if it's all its own entity and not connected with the region, because obviously it is highly connected. So it might be helpful if there's some effort through this work to get some baseline at that